Okay. You're on.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our monthly speaker series. Today we have the pleasure of meeting our fellow member and friend, Bill Walston. A little bit background on Bill. Bill was born and raised in the New Haven, Connecticut area. After graduating high school, Bill had to work 2 years to earn money for college. But during that time, Bill was the Connecticut State YMCA wrestling champion. You didn't want to mess with him. He attended and graduated cum laude from the University of North Dakota with a BS degree in business administration. Following college, he served as a lieutenant in the U.S. Army. After the Army, Bill worked for U.S. Steel and Wire Division in Cleveland, Ohio, as a system analyst and programmer. During his time at U.S. Steel, he was involved in several community organizations such as Goodwill, the North Pittsburgh Library Foundation, and president of his homeowners association. Bill will talk about his time on President Reagan's private sector survey covering cost control and other interesting events. Please join me in welcoming our friend and your neighbor, Bill Walston.
Thank you. Before I start, I would like to add a little to the comments printed in the Tide and some of the comments that Lee just mentioned. So you know a little more about my frame of reference and the issues that life in the Lord puts in front of you. I came from a very poor family. I was the oldest son in a family of 7 children. And I worked at any job I could from age 10 or 11 to help at home. Beginning at age 14 and through high school, I worked at a dairy farm that started operations about 1.5 miles from my home. I worked a 6.5-day week, Sunday afternoons off, starting at 4:30 in the morning for 2.5 or 3 hours, and returning at 3:30 in the afternoon for 3 hours. I was paid 85 cents an hour and gave most of my money to my mother to help feed our family. Now let's get to business here. I wanted to discuss some of the unusual experiences I had over the life of my business career, beginning with my role as a member of President Reagan's private sector survey on cost control, probably better known as the Grace Commission, named after J. Peter Grace, who headed the effort for the president. During President Reagan's first term, one of his most famous lines was, "Government is not the solution to the problem, it is the problem." He also resurrected the term "drain the swamp." To follow through on these thoughts, he established the Grace Commission by executive order in 1982. Its purpose was to conduct an in-depth review of the operations of the executive agencies using private sector techniques, experience, and expertise. The reviews would then form the basis for evaluating and recommending potential improvements in agency operations. Participants were to make recommendations for increased efficiency and reduced costs in the federal government that might be realized through executive action or legislation. An executive organization was established to accomplish these objectives. At the top of the organization was an executive committee appointed by President Reagan. The committee was chaired by Peter Grace. He also headed a management office for the effort. The heart of the organization was the task forces established to conduct the actual reviews. The task force leaders were executive officers from several private sector companies. 22 task forces were responsible for reviewing specific agencies, ranging from the Department of Agriculture to the Veterans Administration. I was included in the Treasury Department Task Force, which is headed by 3 co-chairs: Al Britton from Bankers Trust, Bill Donaldson from Donaldson Enterprises, and John Filer from Aetna. John was on U.S. Steel's board of directors. The Treasury Department Task Force had 4 task teams. I was the task team leader for the IRS. There were just over 1,000 private sector participants in the survey. The Treasury Task Force had 42 members. There were 17 on my task force, with 6 from U.S. Steel, 2 from Cigna, 2 from Pete Morrick and Mitchell, and 1 each from Westinghouse, Travelers Insurance, Bentley College, and Price Waterhouse. Would you want to put that first slide on? We also had a secretary and 2 research assistants. I just want to make a comment about one of the members of, let's see, next slide. This gentleman right here. That's the man from Bentley College. And if you think academic arrogance is an issue now, this was 40 years ago. And when I set my first meeting up for the team, he called me and said, I'd like to meet with you before we have our meeting. I said, okay, let's have breakfast. So we did. And the first thing he brought up at breakfast was, I think U.S. Steel ought to pay my expenses. He says, because I'm a tax attorney. I said, well, I have a man from U.S. Steel from our tax department who is also a tax attorney. So I don't think we need your help with that. And he said, well, then I think I ought to replace you as the head of this committee because I know more about the IRS than you do. And I said, well, what do you know about cost control and finding efficiencies? He says, and that kind of ended that conversation, except he went above my head to the guy I reported to and tried to convince them that he should replace me, the head of this committee. He got turned down, obviously. But our first meeting with the deputy commissioner of the IRS and his managers, our first meeting, he was at that meeting, and I outlined what we're going to talk about and what our line of questioning would be. And he interrupted and said, he doesn't know what he's talking about. You're not going to have to respond to any of those questions. And the deputy commissioner said, we'd be happy to respond to those questions. That's the last meeting that gentleman ever participated in. Not because I said anything, he just would not do it. So, before I relate the particulars of my involvement in the IRS, it's a personal background that led me there may be of interest. After 2 years of active duty as an infantry officer training recruits at Fort Jackson, just up the road here outside of Columbia, I was hired by U.S. Steel's American Steel and Wire Division at its headquarters in Cleveland, Ohio. I started as a systems analyst and programmer in Cleveland because that's where my beautiful and gracious fiancée Sharon lived, in Mentor, Ohio. Shortly after we were married, September 1963, U.S. Steel started eliminating the steel-related divisional structure. So in December 1963, I was promoted and transferred as a cost analyst to a wire plant in Waukegan, Illinois. I was promoted and transferred 6 times in 12 years, from Cleveland to Waukegan to DeKalb, Illinois, to Joliet, Illinois, where our first son, Keith, who's sitting here, was born. And then Pittsburgh, where I joined U.S. Steel's chemical division, to Haverhill, where my second son, Scott, was born, and then back to Pittsburgh as staff supervisor, cost planning and cost control. Over the next few years, I was promoted to director of cost and statistics and assistant controller of the chemical division. At that time, U.S. Steel had a personnel program called cross-fertilization, if you can believe that, for supposedly high potential individuals. I was selected under that program to be cross-fertilized and become director of personnel for U.S. Steel's headquarters staff groups, accounting and finance, tax, legal, public affairs, purchasing, traffic, real estate, etc. Finally getting to the point, it was in this role that I was selected to be U.S. Steel's representative on President Reagan's Grace Commission. They wanted someone with both accounting and finance and personnel experience, which is not a common occurrence, to head the survey of the IRS as part of the Treasury Department task force. Funding for this effort was provided by the private sector. The salaries and expenses for me and my team were paid by our employers. The Treasury Task Force had its first meeting on June 23, 1982. It was not a particularly auspicious start for me since I was given the wrong address for the meeting and arrived over an hour late. Adding to a somewhat fitful start, it took a couple of weeks to arrange matters at U.S. Steel and at home, so I could be gone 3 or 4 days a week. I was still required to do my job at U.S. Steel, so I worked 3 or 4 days in Pittsburgh and 3 or 4 days in Washington, D.C., a 7-day work week. We were provided offices in the Interstate Commerce Building, which is close to the IRS building, and a short walk for our many meetings. I had to arrange and schedule meetings with the Director of OMB, Tax Court, the IRS Commissioner, Roscoe Wager at that time, and other IRS managers. You can imagine my thoughts when I was assigned responsibility for the IRS, asked to conduct an in-depth review of a nationwide organization with nearly 90,000 employees, a multi-billion-dollar budget, 59 districts, 7 regions, and 10 service centers, and have recommendations for substantial improvements in 3 months. It's quite a challenge. I would like to note here that my team was highly impressed with the dedication, competence, and professionalism most of the IRS. The commissioner, a retired Pricewaterhouse managing partner, established an atmosphere of cooperation that prevailed throughout our study. During our trips to the regional district and service center offices in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Austin, and Dallas, we received full cooperation and gracious hospitality. One exception was the first commissioner staff meeting I attended to explain our effort to find ways to reduce cost. The general counsel, who apparently had never worked in business, said, "I doubt you can find ways to reduce costs. He says, all you business guys do is raise prices when your costs increase." We also had a mid-project meeting with the Secretary of the Treasury, Don Regan, and some members of Congress. My sense was that the Secretary was not too happy with this undertaking. Bringing outsiders in to independently evaluate your organization was probably uncomfortable. One congressman from California said, "I want all the data on one of the subjects I talked about, I discussed, sent to my office, knowing full well that we could not do that." All the Treasury task teams met their due dates, and a consolidated Treasury Task Force draft report was submitted to the co-chairman. Once they made their revisions, if any, a draft report was submitted to the Private Sector Program Management Committee. They, in turn, prepared a summary report for the Executive Committee, who then reported to the President. The Executive Committee was free to modify and or reject recommendations if they felt it was necessary to do so. I was not permitted to submit any of our official recommendations directly to the IRS or any outside parties. In fact, to this day, I was never released from my commitment to not disclose to anyone our specific recommendations. However, I could discuss the issues we chose to examine. Briefly, the 7 issues were as follows. First, it was apparent early in our work that there was considerable debate between the IRS, Treasury, and OMB regarding the credibility of the methodology used by each organization to determine the benefit of personal additions. The ongoing debate consumed inordinate manpower resources and resulted in some questionable staffing decisions. Perhaps most importantly was our finding that most modeling efforts did not recognize functional interdependence. This was not the real world in both revenue generation and workload. For our second issue, we reviewed the organizational structure of the IRS. We found at its then present three-tiered structure, the national level, regional level, and district service center level, had multiple management layers, not counting staff and assistant to positions. There were 9 national office layers, 5 regional office layers, and 8 district office service center layers. This resulted, obviously, in very extended channels of communication, complicated the decision-making process, and did not permit clear identification of authority and responsibility for results. Since the primary function of the IRS is planning for the administration of the tax laws and then execution of those plans, our findings suggested that a simplified planning and execution structure, reporting from the district service center level through the regions to national, would be more appropriate. There was an apparent obsession with not making mistakes. This is endemic of the IRS. There were about 5,200 staff years expended on program and quarterly reviews. For example, there was significant effort spent on the manual verification of a computer-generated error register, which overlapped statistical sampling, somewhat redundant. Also, human resources information system did not exist. When we started our project, a current and complete structural organization chart could not be found. The third issue we reviewed was collection of delinquent taxes. We found that tax accounts receivable had increased from $8.3 billion in 1977 to $23.7 billion in June 1982. Additionally, during the prior 5 years, write-offs had increased 110% to $535 million in 1981. It was also interesting to note that current receivable amounts were not readily available, so it took some time to determine and verify the amount. Since 1977, accounts receivable had almost tripled. On a constant dollar basis, it had increased 77% during that period. Tax-linked accounts, TDAs, issuance increased 103%. Despite these increases, the number of revenue officers decreased 15%. Our fourth issue involved the utilization of ADP capabilities. Our findings indicated that while the number of returns processed at some service centers was increasing, there was also reductions in workload at other locations. These observations were not new to the IRS, since there was a full awareness of the difference in activity levels between service centers. There was a plan to balance the workload with completion in 4 or 5 years of systems replacements at the service centers. With the implementation of the new systems, even the busiest service centers would have a certain level of excess capacity. This was puzzling because we heard there were 2 new service centers being considered at $250 million each. Also at that time, most service centers were working only 1 to 1.5 shifts a day. At one of our meetings, I suggested they consider 3-shift operations. They felt there would not be enough people willing to work shifts. I pointed out that U.S. Steel had a large corporate computer service center in Pittsburgh that operated 3 shifts a day for years. I also suggested if they went to 3-shift operations, they could shut down 2 of the 10 service centers. Interesting response. That was that if we were to consider that, we would like you, me personally, to meet with a congressman or congresswoman in whose district that service center would be closed and see what the response would be. A fifth issue we reviewed was the appeals and tax court backlog. Our review indicated that a systemic change was required to speed the resolution of small tax cases. These cases represented much too large a portion of the effort required at appeals. The litigation division in tax court, since they represented only a small portion of the total dollars at stake. Speedier and more efficient resolution of these small cases would result in more IRS and tax court time available to resolve the larger, more complex issues. This would provide taxpayers with earlier certainty and government with accelerated revenue flow. A sixth issue involved volunteer taxpayer service. In 1982, the IRS answered about 40 million phone calls, primarily during the filing season. Over 60% of the calls were tax law inquiries. A GEO study in 1982 showed that during the filing season, 11% of all taxpayers contacted the IRS by phone and 9% in person. With government budget restrictions, the IRS did not have the resources to continue this effort. Approximately 75% of the taxpayers who contacted the IRS felt they would have a significant problem if responses to the law questions were discontinued. Nearly 7% of taxpayers in general indicated they would consider not filing return if the IRS no longer responded to inquiries. That would not bode well for our voluntary tax compliance system. It was apparent that a body of potential volunteers qualified to provide tax law and tax preparation assistance exists. Retired IRS personnel, retired CPAs, and other interested retired professionals. I'm sure some of you helped in this effort, as I did for some of the elderly at our church in Pittsburgh. The seventh and final issue we reviewed was called Enhanced Enforcement Presence. Our findings indicated that noncompliance was a growing problem beyond the immediate impact or substantial revenue losses was the concern that growing noncompliance threatened the voluntary self-assessment system I alluded to in my last issue. The IRS generated less than 2% of annual revenue directly from enforcement programs. The remaining 98% is voluntarily assessed by and paid by the taxpayer. Therefore, even relatively minor declines in taxpayer compliance easily overshadows any reasonable increase of revenue generated by enforcement efforts. A relative set of statistics indicated that the tax gap tripled from $31.5 billion in 1973 to $97 billion in 1982. The growth of the tax gap underscored a decline in taxpayer compliance. The Taxpayer Compliance Measurement Program, TCMP, suggested that a steady, though not uniform, decline had occurred in all taxpayer classes since the first survey in 1964. With the strong efforts of my team, we studied the 7 issues for which we provided 20 recommendations. Total potential annual benefits was estimated at $2.3 billion. This included, among other things, a total reduction of 11,319 staff years, partially offset by an increase of 9,760 staff years in certain specific functions. The net reduction was 1,559 staff years. As is apparent, an opportunity existed for a certain amount of personnel redeployment. In addition to the 20 formal recommendations, we were permitted to discuss opportunities for further cost savings, like closing the 2 service centers I mentioned earlier. However, deserving special attention was our view that the most important endeavor that should be undertaken was the development of a sophisticated management information system. Most of the issues that surfaced may not have become issues if a system was in place that appropriately focused management attention. Most certainly, these and other issues would be more effectively and quickly dealt with if a comprehensive database feeding properly constructed systems was in place. Also of great importance was the need to fill the vacant associate commissioner of systems position with a highly competent administrator. It had been vacant for several years. Shortly after we completed the survey, I was invited by the commissioner to make a presentation to a national conference of IRS personnel in Washington, D.C. I agreed to do so. My talk lasted about an hour, expanded much beyond what I just outlined, about an hour, followed by a question and answer period. After about 45 minutes of questions, the commissioner intervened, saying they had more items on their agenda and they were running out of time. It may be interesting to know that none of the questions I received were hostile. They were seriously interested in the issues we raised. When I returned to Pittsburgh, the commissioner sent a very nice letter to U.S. Steel's chairman, Dave Roderick, thanking him for our efforts. I was then asked if I would invite the commissioner to attend one of our regular management employee luncheon meetings at an adjacent hotel. I did, and he accepted the invitation. We first met in the chairman's office, and he made a very complimentary presentation at the luncheon. Shortly after that, he called me and asked if I would like to participate in a citizens committee that met regularly in Washington, D.C. to discuss a wide range of issues. I told him I would think about it and call him back. I called him back and told him I had already spent too much time away from my family. There were a number of issues to deal with at U.S. Steel, and I was involved in a number of community organizations. I respectfully declined. I don't want to mention one other comment about the harassment I got at U.S. Steel when I got back there, because they told me I was going to be audited every year for the rest of my life. I never got an audit from the IRS. There are a couple of after-action events that might be of interest. I got several calls from different reporters asking for an interview about our effort. I declined those interviews. Also, a few months after the effort, U.S. Steel received a request from me, to go to Beijing, China for several weeks to assist in installing a financial and accounting control system. Thankfully, they said no. Just an interesting aside here, Sharon and I were in our church back in Pittsburgh. There were churches in a group that had support for international students, and we would have dinners for them in Pittsburgh. And the last dinner we went to, we sat with Chinese students, and they were all advanced degree students in STEM disciplines. And I asked them that in our conversations, what they plan to do after they graduated, because there were a lot of jobs available in the United States. They said, oh no. All of this is, all our costs and everything are paid for by the Chinese government. And we got to go back. If we don't go back, they'll come and get us. So, the Grace Commission's final report was presented to Congress in January 1984. 2 years after we completed our tasks, the report showed that if its recommendations were followed, $424 billion could be saved in 3 years, rising to $1.9 trillion per year by year 2000. 73% of the report's recommendations required congressional action. They took no action. The balance, or 27%, required executive action. Most of those were implemented. Now off the Reagan thing, another unusual experience I had as director of personnel occurred when U.S. Steel acquired Marathon Oil. Right after the acquisition, I was asked by the Vice President of Human Resources to lead the team to Marathon's headquarters in Findlay, Ohio, a short distance from Pittsburgh. Myself, the Director of Exempt Compensation, and the Director of Employee Benefits were to meet our counterparts in Marathon's headquarters to discuss company policies and procedures in these areas. We arrived midday and were invited to a lunch before we started our meetings. As we finished lunch, we were told that the chairman of Marathon wanted to meet us before we started our meetings. So we went to his office, and I introduced myself and the others to the chairman. I watched him as I spoke, and he was obviously agitated and proceeded to get bright red and said in a very loud voice, "All I want to know is what the F blank 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 are you doing here?" Standing at his side was his CFO, who said loudly, "I have a call into Bruce Thomas, U.S. Steel's CFO. Find out what's going on here." So I began answering his question. I said, since we are now one company, it's important that we understand our policies and practices in these areas. For example, we both have public affairs offices in Washington, D.C., so we should be sure we coordinate our messaging with the politicians, various government organizations, and bureaus and lobbyists. He said, "Well, I see I have not intimidated you, so go have your meetings." When I returned to Pittsburgh the next day, I went to the vice president's office to express my displeasure at being set up that way. His comment, "We knew you could handle it." I was not happy with that answer. As some of you probably know, USX's marriage with Marathon was somewhat short-lived, with some significant involvement from Carl Icahn. And they did change their name, though it was changed from U.S. Steel to USX. Not long after I returned from my Grace Commission assignment, I was promoted to controller of USX Chemical Division. It seems USX had to reopen their 1980 books because the current controller had allowed the operating executives to change purchase order terms at the end of the year. It had a material effect on year-end results, and the public accountants caught it in their year-end audit. As it turned out, accepting that promotion in those circumstances was not a wise decision, but that's another story. In October 1986, USX publicly announced its plan to form a new public company from its chemical division called Aristec Chemical, and offer the company's common stock to the investing public in an initial public offering on December 4th, 1986. The name Aristec was a combination of two Greek words, aristos meaning excellent, and techne meaning craft. Thus, excellence in craft became the motto of the new company. We then had meetings with Dun & Bradstreet to review our books. This is a process some of you, I'm sure you're familiar with, but we had meetings with Dun & Bradstreet to review our books, procedures, and et cetera, and with Goldman Sachs and Chairman Lehman, the underwriters. We took them to several of our plants so they could kick the tires, so to speak, and assess the plant management. And one day, using USX corporate jet, we visited plants in Ohio, West Virginia, Arkansas, and Texas, and returned to Pittsburgh that night. We had several meetings arranging our separation from USX. Information systems, finance, accounting, treasury, legal, human resources, and et cetera are all services provided by USX that we now had to provide for ourselves. I had responsibility for the financial accounting and information systems transition. The transaction was completed with USX receiving about $530 million in proceeds from the sale. On the first day of trading, we were all in New York. I'm going to put that next slide up. We were all in New York at the stock exchange. As was the practice at that time, company officers were all at the stock exchange when Aristec was the first trade that came across the board. No, that's another slide. Another slide.
Go to the first one.
No, keep going. No, keep going. No, there you go. In any event, this was the cast of characters that were the officers of the company when we spun off. Shares opened at 17 3/8 and about 4.5 million shares traded, making it one of the most active issues on the big board that day, closing at 18 3/8. The chairman, CFO, and general counsel are all, the three guys in the middle. The chairman, CFO, and general counsel are all from USX, had reached limits of their USX careers. The president and senior vice president from USS Chemicals Division. Over the next couple of years, sales exceeded $1 billion and net income increased to $68 million. However, in February 1989, John Huntsman, chairman of Huntsman Chemical, made an offer for the company. His primary interests were the phenol acetone and polypropylene product lines. He was rebuffed and became more insistent, culminating in a hostile 1989 takeover bid. And then when those things happen, you go through the same auditing process and review the books and so forth. So that took a lot of time. This resulted in a management-led leveraged buyout with Mitsubishi Corporation, a Japanese marketing company. They were a worldwide marketing organization and wanted availability to some of our products. In January 1990, Aristec accepted the Mitsubishi proposal. They were in control of the company. I visited Mitsubishi headquarters in Tokyo a number of times, meeting with them and their banks. We did some refinancing as well of the initial acquisition debt. And I just wanted to mention that I met with bond counsel in New York a number of times, but the bond counsel I met with was in the Twin Towers. And when the Twin Towers went down, their company got destroyed. Being a cyclical chemical company, sales and profits fell off significantly in the early 1990s. In 1994, the top 5 executives retired with close to a $90 million payout. The new chairman was from Mitsubishi. Then a program began to divest of businesses that had been part of the company for many years. There then began a significant turnover in executive management. Mitsubishi named a new chairman. The business was on a downward slide. I decided to retire as treasurer in 1999. About 2 or 3 months after I retired, I got a call from the chairman. He asked if I had any idea why PNC, Pittsburgh National Bank, the bank he had established a line of credit with many years ago, had withdrawn our line of credit. I was not surprised. About a year and a half after I retired, Aristec no longer existed. Some plants were closed and others were sold to other chemical companies. I was involved in Aristec, I was involved in almost the outset on a vibrant chemical division, then called USS Chemicals, the division of U.S. Steel. I participated in acquisitions and the construction of new plants. I was vice president of Tennis Chemicals, a joint venture between Tenneco and U.S. Steel, which is not included when we spun off. So it was very disappointing to see how it all ended, particularly for the non-executive employees that lost their jobs. And I'm sorry we have to end on that note, but that's it. So I'll be happy to answer any questions. Yes.
Did I hear you correctly that when you were part of the Grace Commission and you were auditing the work or reviewing the work of the IRS, that the enforcement part of the IRS, when they re-audit only
I can't hear you, Tom. Speak up.
Here, I'll get the mic. Stand up. Here, Mr. Cortez.
Yeah, by the way, the last slide I wanted to show, if you'll do that, was the last annual report for Aristec Chemical Corporation before,
Let me try it again. Okay.
if you want to show that slide.
All right. So, Bill, when you were with the IRS, when you were reviewing the work of the IRS, did you find that the auditing or rechecking or enforcement part of the IRS only produced 2 or 3% more of revenue for the IRS?
Yeah, that's what it was.
And so
Most of
waste,
the, pardon me?
it's a waste of effort.
Well, I wouldn't say it's a wasted effort. I mean, in the U.S., we have a voluntary tax system. We all file our, so the predominant revenue from taxes is because people voluntarily assess their own taxes. But 2% is a big number that they have to go after, right? There's some big violators that they have to pursue.
Thank you.
No, this is the letter I got from Ronald Reagan, the president. I'm sure all of the task team leaders got letters like this, but this is a letter thanking us for our efforts. And then there was one other slide in the last one that was, was a kind of sad event for me because it was the last. No, you have to keep going forward.
Okay.
There you go. That's the last annual report for Aristec Chemical when I was controller. So then became owned by Mitsubishi.
Okay, I think Mrs. Cortez has a question.
Oh, Bill, I'm a bit curious to know if you had, I didn't catch it, but did you have an opportunity to meet President Reagan personally, and what kind of a person was he, face to face?
I was invited to a reception on the Rose Garden that spring, but I had already scheduled a trip with my family, and I was not going to disappoint him again. So I did not go to the. So I'm sorry, I can't answer.
Does anybody else have a question? Did you want to talk about any of your other slides that you have?
Well, thank you, Bill. That was a very interesting story of your life. We appreciate it. Give him a nice welcome. I'm sure there's a lot of people out there sitting here that has a story just as good as Bill.
I'm sure they did. Yep.
And just come see me anytime, and we'll schedule you. We hold our monthly speaker series the second Monday of every month. Next month we have Beverly Shipka on October the 11th, second Tuesday, Monday. So put that on your calendar. You'll see it in the Tide, and she has a nice story too. All right, thank you for coming here, and thanks, Bill.
Thank you.